Have you not heard? Has it not been told? There is a story of old.
Archbishop Dominiquae Bierman has traveled the world for over 3 decades proclaiming the gospel from Zion to the nations with miracles following. She exposes the false doctrines of replacement theology and preaches restoration to the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach.
That a lion has defeated a dragon. A lion has defeated a dragon. A lion has defeated a dragon. The Lion of Judah has defeated the dragon. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Today we're going to talk about Mother Rachel. Rachel. Rachel, the one that was so loved by Jacob and yet suffered. Rachel and Jacob had a kind of a tragic romance, just kind of like Romeo and Juliet, but it's kind of the biblical Romeo and Juliet in this case. We're going to see how come, what happened, and how Rachel was managing with all of the setbacks in her life. Rachel is the 3rd mother of Israel. And Rachel was a shepherdess. In fact, her name, Rachel, means a ewe lamb. And she was a shepherdess. And Jacob had been sent by his mother Rebekah to go and find for himself a bride far away from Canaan. She didn't want him to have the women of Canaan. She wanted him to have women that came from around the surroundings of the areas where Abraham came from. And so he goes back to the area of Assyria, Aram at the time, and he goes back to try to find that wife of his. And he comes to the well, and the well is the place of meeting for everybody, but most particularly for women. In fact, women very often could be found at the well. There were the water carriers, and often there were even the shepherdesses. In this case, the shepherds also came to the well to water the flocks. And Rachel was a shepherdess, a pastor of sorts, right? A shepherdess, and she came as well. And it was love at first sight. Let's take a look. What happens in Genesis 29, 9-12. While Jacob was still speaking with the other shepherds, Rachel came with a flock that belonged to her father, for she was a shepherdess. Now when Yaakov saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob stepped forward and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Then Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. So immediately this young girl simply moves the heart of Jacob. He begins to weep. He becomes so emotional when he meets her, of course, because he knows that finally he has connected with the family of his mother, and he could be able to even find a bride. So he goes and runs after her. Laban receives him, welcomes him very nicely, very warmly. And Jacob, being the man that he is, as I said in the episode about Rebekah, that Jacob was not an usurper, he was not a deceiver. He sought to do what is right at all times. And in this case, the same. He didn't want to stay in the house of Laban just as a leech, just eating and drinking and doing nothing. But rather, he offered to serve Laban and to work for his food. And he did work for his food, but Laban never paid him any wages. He just worked and worked. And we're going to see this straight in Jacob's life, that he was a hard worker all the time. Every time trying to do the right thing in every situation, in spite of all the setbacks. In Genesis 29, 15-18, Laban wakes up that he's not paying wages to Jacob. And this is where we have Rachel coming into the picture. Then Laban said to Jacob, should you, my relative, serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob was in love with Rachel. So he said, let me serve you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. So Laban agrees, absolutely. He says, not a problem. Go ahead and work for me for 7 years, and you will get Rachel as your wife. Well, imagine, this Jacob was so in love with Rachel. It was love at first sight, this Romeo and Juliet kind of story. And he sets to work, and it says that actually it's really like only a few days. In Genesis 29, 19 to 23, Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than I give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years, yet in his eyes it was like a few days because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are completed, so I may go to her. So Laban gathered all the men of the place, and he prepared a feast. When it was evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and he went to her. Well. You know, in a wedding feast, people drink wine. And normally, like by the end of the wedding feast, everybody's a bit tipsy. And then on top of it, it becomes dark. And as everybody's tipsy and it becomes dark, actually Laban is a deceiver. Laban is definitely an usurper deceiver, not Jacob. Laban comes and tricks him. And of course, at that time, you know, women were covered completely. Like today, you may see many Arab women or Muslim women, they're very covered. They've got a burqa, they've got all kinds of headpieces and the long dresses and that. And sometimes you do not really see who is behind the veil. And so he simply receives the woman believing in good faith, naively, that this man Laban is going to fulfill the promise that he gave him. He's been working his heart out. And then he gives him Leah. But oh boy, he wasn't happy, because there he found that it was Leah. In Genesis 29, 24 to 30, Laban also gave her Zilpah, his female servant, to his daughter Leah, as a female servant. So when it was morning, behold, there she was, Leah. So he said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Wasn't it for Rachel that I worked with you? So why have you deceived me? But Laban said, it's not done so in our place, to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the bridal week for this one, then we'll also give you this other for work that you will do with me in the future, another 7 years more. So Jacob did. He also completed this once bridal week. Then he gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban also gave his daughter Rachel his female servant, Bilhah, to be a servant for her. Jacob also went to Rachel and indeed loved Rachel more than Leah, so he served with him for yet another 7 years. What can I tell you? Difficult situation, not only for Jacob, for Rachel. Rachel is expecting to be married to the love of her life. Jacob is expecting to be married to the love of her life. And both of them are completely deceived by the father of Rachel. We want to remember this deception, because this is going to be the style of Laban concerning Jacob all the way through until the end. And we're going to see how this must have affected Rachel, his daughter, because her own father literally betrayed her and gave her elder sister to her betrothed. They were betrothed, technically. And so Rachel now becomes the love of the life of Jacob, but the one that is actually giving birth is Leah. Remember that the first seed of Jacob was given to the womb of Leah. And so we see here that Leah is the one that begins to give birth. She's very fruitful. She's multiplying. She seems to be blessed. but Rachel is not. Because in Genesis 29:31 it says, now Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. I'm going to tell you something. Often, Yahweh is a just God. And he likes to even out things and, balance things out. He saw that Leah was rejected. She was unloved. She was not as beautiful as Rachel. And so what did he do? He gave her children. He wanted to comfort her. He didn't want her to be depressed all day long. So he blessed Leah. Later on, when we will talk about Leah, we will see what kind of a character Leah had. But right now, for Rachel's sake, we need to realize that Rachel now, she's the most loved, but she's a barren womb. She cannot have any children. And therefore, that causes her also to become jealous of her elder sister.
I hope you're enjoying this program about the powerful women of the Bible. Actually, I had a problem with women in leadership, and I wrote a book to help you. I invite you to get my book, The Women Factor, and be set free.
I am immovable in you, unshakable in you, and I am full of grace. I am immovable in you, unshakable in you, and I am full of faith. Your word.
So now we're going to see these things because we're going to see some traits in Rachel's life that we should learn to avoid at all costs. Even though she was beautiful, even though she was loved, even though she was pretty courageous and creative like all the other two mothers, she also had some character traits that we need to be careful with. And those are the character traits of jealousy, and especially jealousy, really. So, while Leah goes ahead and births Jacob all the children, Rachel did the same thing that Sarah did with Abraham. She said, well, I can't birth, and she was complaining to Jacob all the time. Give me children or I will die. And Jacob said, what am I, God, that I can give you children? Isn't it enough? Am I not enough to you? More than all the children, I love you the most. But that was not enough, because remember that every one of our mothers, they needed to fulfill the promises given to Abraham, and therefore the way to fulfill the promise to Abraham and the promise to Eve, that there will be a seed that will be born that will crush the head of the snake in Genesis chapter 3, then they needed to birth children, because the seed will come through natural childbirth. It wasn't a spiritual seed, it was a natural seed that will be put there until finally the spiritual seed will come into the woman that was Miriam, or Mary, the mother of Yeshua. And so now we see that she's unhappy. Rachel becomes unhappy, she becomes jealous, she's cherished, she's absolutely adored by Jacob, she's loved, but she's not happy, and she becomes jealous of her sister. Genesis 31:5 tells us, when Rachel saw that she bore no children for Jacob, Rachel was jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me sons. If there are none, I'll die. But Jacob became furious with Rachel and said, am I instead of God the one who withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So she said, here is my maidservant Bilhah. Go to her and let her give birth on my knees, so that from her I may also build a family. Then she gave her a maidservant Bilhah to him for a wife, and Yaakov went to her. Bilhah became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Jacob. So here we go. We see that Bilhah becomes pregnant, just like in the case of Hagar for Sarah. And in it's exactly the same case, the principle is that the maidservants are the property of their mistresses, and whatever is born of the womb of the maidservant belongs to the mistress. By the way, we will see in the same way in the Torah, in Leviticus, when we talk about the laws of slaves, we're going to see exactly the same situation where Yahweh says that if a slave is born, a woman slave bears the child, then that child belongs to the master of the house. And so the same thing in this situation. However, Elohim is really faithful to his promise. And even though it may take tests and it may take time, he fulfills his promise. In the case of Rachel, it wasn't immediate. It took many, many years until she finally could conceive and bear the first son for her beloved Yaakov. Beloved, I've repeated it again in other series. We need to realize that on the way to the fulfillment of the promise, we are going to be tested. We are going to see when, let's say, Yahweh Elohim goes and promotes someone else above us. Are we going to get jealous? Are we going to get angry? Or are we going to humble our hearts and wait in faith for the fulfillment of the promise? Are we going to wait in faith for the answer to the prayers? It's very, very important that we shun jealousy, we shun strife, we shun anger, and all of those attitudes. And I always say to all the people that, have been discipled by me, and I tell them that your attitude will always determine your altitude. Is it an attitude of faith, an attitude of grace, an attitude of forgiveness, or is it jealousy, bitterness, and anger? And victim, when you become the victim and you begin to pout and you begin to resist. Well, in the case of Rachel, apparently somewhere she must have come to terms with the fact that, okay, her maidservant now gave birth, so now she can rest a little bit from that insistence that she needed to become pregnant. And that happens to many women. When they stop being anxious about it, they become pregnant. In Genesis 30, 22-24, it says, "Then Elohim God remembered Rachel, and Elohim listened to her and opened her womb. Then she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. So she said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph, saying, may Yahweh add another son to me." So she gets Joseph, and Joseph himself is named in such a way that she holds on to the tzitzit, to the hem of the garment of Yahweh, literally to his, to his heart, and says, hey, thank you that you answered my prayer, but don't forget to keep on doing it. So give me another son. Hallelujah. And Yahweh listens to her too, and she does get another son. But it doesn't happen so easily, because what happens is that now Jacob comes to the end of himself. Jacob has been cheated by Laban so many times. Laban cheats him in the wages. He cheated him in the wife. Laban has become really an enemy of Jacob in every way, shape, and form. And Jacob knows that it's time for him to leave. And the God of his fathers, the father Abraham and Isaac, which is the God of Israel, visits him and gives him a strategy on how he should leave Laban and go back to Canaan. It was time to return to the land of Canaan. The mission was accomplished. Jacob already found a bride, not bride, but 2 brides and 2 maidservants. Now he has a lot of children, 12 children and 1 daughter, and now it's time to take all of his family back to the land of promise, to Canaan. But something happens on the way, and we're going to take a look at this. As he's preparing to leave, and he gathers all of his family and tells them it's time to go back to Canaan, and he already has a lot of flock, because we're not going to enter into the story, but Jacob had a dream on how to obtain a flock because Laban was cheating him all the time. And he said to Laban that he wanted to leave, but his wages would be that all of the speckled and spotted sheep and goats, they belonged to Jacob. In other words, whenever speckled and spotted goats would be born, they would belong to Jacob, and he will build up his flock that way, because after so many years of serving Laban, he didn't have anything to his name. That's how unrighteous Laban was with him. And so Yahweh showed him in a dream that he was going to bless him in such a way that all of the strong sheep and goats would bear speckled and spotted. And eventually he had a flock that was even stronger than Laban, but he knew that Laban wasn't going to let him live so easily, so he actually escapes Laban. And let's see what happens with Rachel when he decides to escape Laban, the father of Rachel. In Genesis 31, 19-24, we read, "But while Laban went to shear his flocks, Rachel stole the idols that belonged to her father. While Jacob stole the heart from Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was fleeing. he himself fled with everything that belonged to him. And he got up and crossed the river and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. When Laban was told on the third day after Jacob had fled, he took his relatives with him and pursued him a 7 days' journey. Then he overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. But Elohim God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Watch yourself, lest you say anything to Jacob, good or bad." So even though Laban was after Jacob, he was really upset. He could have actually killed him. Elohim vindicated Jacob. He didn't see Jacob as an usurper or as a thief. And that's again part of all of these wrong theologies about Jacob that are rooted in anti-Semitism. He didn't see Jacob as a thief or as an usurper. He saw Jacob as somebody that was executing justice because Yahweh himself had given Jacob that flock. And he knew that Laban was crooked and he would not let him live with the flock that belonged to him. It wasn't like he stole it from Laban. He had worked very hard and received no wages. And Yahweh told him what to do. So that's not a theft. And so Laban tells Jacob the following in Genesis 31:29-32. Said, "It is in the power of my hand to do evil with you. But yesterday the God of your father spoke to me, saying, watch yourself lest you say anything to Jacob, good or bad. So now when you're up and left because you really missed your father's house, why did you steal my gods?" In response, Yaakov said to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I thought, suppose you snatch your daughters away from me. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In front of our relatives, identify whatever is yours that is with me and take it back." But Yaakov did not know that Rachel had stolen them. You see, here we go. Rachel stole the gods, the idols of her father, and took them with her. And that's a good question. Why would she have done something like that? I personally believe that she was angry with her father because her father gave Leah and not her first, and because she probably blamed her father for her misfortune. And therefore she simply wanted to spitefully do something that would hurt her father. And since her father was an idolater, we learned that because he had gods, he had idols, then Rachel steals those idols from the father. There may be another reason, but I believe she was bitter with him. And now when Laban comes, Jacob knew nothing about this. In other words, Rachel didn't tell her husband, "I've taken the idols of my father." Or she didn't even ask him for permission. "Should I take the idols of my father?" She just simply went ahead and stole those idols from the father. Besides the fact that the word says clearly that when you have all kinds of idols in your house and all kinds of figurines that are for the worship of foreign gods, this will bring a curse upon your household. Well, in the same way, Jacob comes and says to he's so absolutely certain that no one in his party took the idols. He had taught them about the love to the God of Abraham and Isaac. He called him the fear of my father Isaac. He had taught them about the love to Elohim El Shaddai that appeared to Abraham. So he wouldn't have believed that his most adored wife, cherished wife, would have taken those idols. So he went ahead and he said something that eventually would kill Rachel early. He went ahead and he said clearly, wherever you find them, whoever you find, those idols with, then that person will die. Unfortunately, Rachel was the one that had taken them, but Rachel decided to pretend and to lie a little bit more. Now she stole the idols, now she's also becoming a liar. Because she's sitting now on her camel saddle, and the idols are inside of her camel saddle. Now she pretends to have her period. And even then it was very clear that when a woman had her period, you couldn't touch her and the woman couldn't touch you. And you couldn't touch anything that she sat on. And she knew it very well. So she sat on the saddle, she protected those idols, and she said to her father that she has her period and therefore she's not getting up to greet him. So she continues lying. That is very unfortunate. Eventually these things are going to kill Rachel earlier. Now we see that Rachel at that point did not confess to her sin. She was, of course, afraid to die. But we see that Jacob brings them all near to Bethel and allows them to get rid of all the foreign gods that they may have on them. That means his servants and his children and everybody. In Genesis 35, 1-4, then God said to Jacob, "Get up, go up to Bethel and stay there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to everyone who was with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods that are among you. Cleanse yourselves and change your clothes. Now let's get up and go up to Bethel so that I can make an altar there to Elohim, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way that I've gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods in their hand and the rings in the ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak tree near Shechem. The question is, did Rachel get rid of her father's idol at that time? But the scriptures are silent. Maybe she didn't, because then Jacob would have known it was her. But eventually the sin of Rachel finds her. In Genesis 35, 16-20 says, "Then they traveled from Bethel, and while they were still at a distance from entering Ephrat, Rachel began to give birth. She was pregnant again. She had asked from Yahweh for another son. Now she's getting another son. She was pregnant again. So Rachel began to give birth to the first child that is born in the land of Canaan. But her labor was difficult. While she was struggling to give birth, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for this is also a son for you." Now, as her soul was departing, for she died, she named him Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. Then Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrat, that is Bethlehem, behind me here. Jacob set up a memorial stone over her grave. It is the memorial stone over Rachel's grave until this day. Many women of Israel go to the tomb of Rachel to weep and to cry and to ask Yahweh to open their wombs and to answer the prayers that Rachel did. So Rachel is a controversial mother. On one hand, she was full of faith and she believed that God could do the impossible and open her womb. On the other hand, she was not completely straight, and the root of bitterness caused her to do things that she should have never done, and therefore she died earlier than she should have.
I love my wife's new album called Tribute to the Jew in You. I listen to it in the car all the time. You need to get it.
Do not delay your revival, Yahweh. Pour out your ruach like wine. Pour out your spirit like water, Adonai. Anoint your bride. Anoint.
If you enjoyed today's program, support this broadcast by donating to kad-esh.org. To connect with us, write to info@kad-esh.org or mail to 52 Tuscan Way, Suite 202-412, St. Augustine, Florida, 32092, USA. Or call us at 1-972-301-7087. We'd love to hear from you. And join us again next week.